Greetings, sisters and brothers. Welcome to African History Club, episode number 44. I'm your host, Milton Alimadi. I had intended to speak on the ongoing trial of the murderers of Thomas Sankara, the ongoing trial in Burkina Faso of 12 of these assassins. But due to the news update with the military coup d'etat in the Sudan, which occurred yesterday, the October the 25th, I've decided to postpone the discussion of Burkina Faso, the trial of Thomas Sankara's killers, so that I could speak on the coup in the Sudan today. Friends, comrades, sisters and brothers, I'm sure you've heard me say this before. To me, any takeover by the military in any African country, which is not a revolution like the type we saw with Jerry Rawlings in Ghana in 1971 and then returning in 1981. Essentially, Rawlings was able to right the ship somewhat in Ghana and set Ghana toward the path that it enjoys today. Many peaceful transitions of power between one civilian government to the next. Ghana is not perfect, but Ghana is in a much far better space than many African countries. And Jerry Rawlings definitely played a role in that outcome. And in the future, in fact, I will devote a podcast focusing on Jerry Rawlings and Ghana. And then, of course, if it's not a revolution like the type we saw in Burkina Faso with Thomas Sankara, then once again, to me, it's a reactionary, useless coup d'etat in any African country. And such is the case in the Sudan, is what we're witnessing right now. The civilians are opposing, they're coming out and protesting in the streets. And in fact, the military has opened live round fire on these civilian demonstrators, and reportedly 7 have been killed and more than 100 have been injured. I like to first say off the bat that I have no doubt that in the end, the civilians will prevail in Sudan, and the military once again will be sidelined or at least pushed out of absolute power in the Sudan. This is not the first time that civilians in Sudan have challenged the military. Of course, they were instrumental. It was because of the protest by civilians, beginning primarily from 2018, that led to the overthrow of military dictator General Omar Hassan al-Bashir, who had governed from 1989. And in the past, in 1964, civilians were also instrumental in removing a military regime in Sudan, and once again in the 1980s. So they have a tradition of opposing successfully and eventually defeating military regimes in the Sudan. So Sudan has rather a unique history in all of Africa. The professional class have always been very well organized with professional organizations. So you have engineers, you have doctors, you have nurses, you have working class. All of them, you have students. The students are very powerful movements historically in the Sudan. They also had very well organized socialist parties and a Marxist party as well. So they have a tradition, the intelligentsia, students and working class, of effectively organizing and resisting military regimes in the Sudan. And I will see that going ahead in the days ahead, that will be in play as they move forward, because the Sudanese do not want to go back to the era of Omar Hassan al-Bashir. Bashir was defeated in 2018 to 2019. The civilians came out in tens of thousands, and ultimately the military saw that they had no choice but to get rid of their commander, Omar Hassan al-Bashir. But let me go a little bit in the history first of what led to the crises that led to the removal of Bashir, the establishment of a transitional government, and now we are seeing the reactionary militaries, elements in the military trying to reverse this progress. Sudan had undergone a very long and bloody civil war right soon after its independence in January 1956. And this involved, pitted rather, the North, which has strong Islamist influence and favored governing by Sharia law, as opposed to the southern part of the country with African culture, African traditions, and African spirituality. So this war lasted for many decades and really prevented Sudan from realizing its potential, taking advantage of its well-organized intelligentsia class and the working class and the student movements, because the country was fighting against itself, essentially. So this war lasted for decades, and ultimately it led to the division of Sudan into two parts, with a referendum, a peace agreement, and the referendum led to the independence, the creation of the new nation of South Sudan in 2011. And that partition of Sudan also had economic consequences that affected Sudan tremendously, because essentially all of the major oil fields were located in South Sudan. So now Sudan is deprived of a significant portion of the national revenue because it did not own the oil fields under this new arrangement, where you have two separate nations of Sudan with the capital in Khartoum, which had always been its traditional capital, and you have the new nation of South Sudan with its capital in Juba. And then Sudan had also experienced a lot of political instability because, in addition to fighting between the South and the North, the Sudanese regime under Omar Hassan al-Bashir was also engaged in conflict in its Darfur region. And the regime was accused of committing several massacres of the civilian population in Darfur. And in fact, ultimately, Omar Hassan al-Bashir was indicted by the International Criminal Court, the ICC. The ICC is, of course, a political organization, meaning that it indicts criminals selectively. So, for example, a leader like the former Prime Minister, Ben Netanyahu of Israel, of course, is not indicted for the crimes that Israel commits against the Palestinians, because Netanyahu and Israel are considered to be a U.S. ally. And then you have in Uganda, where you have the dictator of 35 years, General Yoweri Museveni, and the crimes committed in Uganda, the crimes committed by his army in Rwanda, the crimes committed by his army in Democratic Republic of the Congo, crimes committed by his army in South Sudan. He's not indicted. Why? Because once again, he's a useful tool of United States foreign interest. But we'll get into that in a separate podcast focusing on the activities of the ICC. Today, we are focusing on the Sudan. So these multiple conflicts weakened the Sudanese economy, and combining the political and economic pressure and the fact that the youth had enough and said enough is enough and came out to the streets in large numbers in 2018 and 2019. Ultimately, the military removed General Omar Hassan al-Bashir, charged him with several crimes, including the coup that had brought him into power and also financial embezzlement. He was found with tens of millions of dollars. I think it was more than $50 million in his residence in cash after he was removed by the military in 2019. So after he was removed, and by the way, the people of Sudan, the young people, the youth, the students, women came out in mass numbers for those protests that ended up with the removal of Omar Hassan al-Bashir. They showed tremendous protests because they came out to the streets on a daily basis, and many of them set up tents and camped right outside the military headquarters in Khartoum, in the capital. And at one point, the military unleashed live round and killed more than 100 of these protesters. The military shut down the internet, and the military essentially was trying to impose its own reactionary coup d'etat against itself. So removing Bashir and replacing him with another reactionary military regime. But the international community on this occasion came out united in condemning these atrocities against the civilians who were protesting peacefully for change in the Sudan. So this considerable pressure caused the military to back off. The internet was restored, and once the internet was restored, we were able to see some of these brutal killings of civilians that the military had committed when the people who had taken these images, photos, and videos were now able to transmit it around the world. And this added the pressure on the regime. Ultimately, the military regime, which had removed Omar Hassan al-Bashir, agreed to negotiations with the civilian pro-democracy movement. Ultimately, the outcome was the creation of what was called a sovereign transitional council that included members of the military and members of the civilian movement. Now, the arrangement was for this transitional council to govern until civilian elections were held and full civilian authority would be returned in Sudan. Now, here was the catch. The military in this coalition, the military was supposed to have the dominant role in the ultimate decision-making within this council for the first 2 years. And then the civilian component of this alliance would have the dominant rule for the remaining term of this transition period, leading to the elections. And the civilian component was supposed to assume this dominant role, I believe, on November the 17th. Therefore, this coup d'etat is not coincidental at all. It's not by chance that it's happening in late October as we head to November, the period when the civilians are supposed to take the dominant role in the sovereign transitional council. So essentially, the military, under the commander of the army, General Abdel Fattah Burhan, is trying to reverse this trend, to seize absolute power, and to undo and end this transition period. They've arrested Abdallah Hamdok, who was the transitional prime minister, and declared a state of emergency. And the military now says it will govern exclusively by itself until 2023, and then hold elections in 2023 in July. And as I said, and as many of you may be following and monitoring, the situation is very fluid, it's evolving, but it's very clear that the Sudanese civilians oppose this, and it's at least what I've seen, most of the major countries that have some influence over activities in the Sudan have also come out to condemn this coup. And I have no doubt that ultimately the civilians who were able to effectively protest, demonstrate, organize, and remove Omar Hassan al-Bashir, will also be able to remove General Burhan and his colleagues. One element that I believe is ongoing is elements of the military that still support Omar Hassan al-Bashir are most likely playing a role in this coup d'etat. Because one of the developments was that the Sudanese authorities had agreed to hand over Omar Hassan al-Bashir to the International Criminal Court to be prosecuted for the alleged crimes committed under his direction in the Darfur region of Sudan. So it's quite possible that elements in the army want to block this transfer, and that is why they decided to take over power before the civilian component of the transitional alliance took power on November the 17th. So that is my summary of the ongoing situation in the Sudan. And obviously, the generals in Sudan have also been emboldened by the recent trends of coup d'etats in other African countries and the tepid reaction to these coups by the African Union, which essentially condoned the initial coup in Mali in August 2020 and did not put immediate effective sanctions to check this coup d'etat in Mali. So by tolerating the takeover in Mali, which of course was in the background condoned by France, because at that time the civilians had also come out in great numbers in Mali and wanted to, in effect, put into power a civilian authority, just like the civilians in Sudan had agitated for change in 2018 and 2019. So in Mali, the military preempted the civilian revolution and put in power a military regime, which of course is what France prefers to deal with in its former African colonies. So by tolerating that takeover in Mali, that also then inspired the coup d'etat in Chad in April this year, after the assassination of the country's long-term dictator. And then he was, of course, succeeded. Deby was succeeded by his Idris Deby succeeded by his son, Mahamata Deby, with the support of France. In fact, when the son was sworn in, the French President Emmanuel Macron was there for the swearing in. So by tolerating selectively coup d'etats in African countries and thinking that it won't happen in other African countries is, of course, completely preposterous. In Mali, there was a civilian and military arrangement, a similar sort of alliance that Sudan had also had in place. But in May of this year, of course, the leader of the coup took over exclusive power, and the civilians were arrested and sidelined. Essentially, exactly the same thing that we are seeing happening in the Sudan had happened in Mali, because the African Union had tolerated that coup d'etat in Mali. And then, of course, recently we also saw the coup d'etat in September in Guinea. And part of it, of course, is also due to the deteriorating economic conditions in most African countries as a result of the COVID pandemic and the impact it's had on economic activity, including tourism. Tourism industry wiped out in most African countries. So that's a loss of billions of dollars. The capacity to produce commodities and minerals and exports. So that also has reduced revenue in many African countries. And in fact, I've been saying over many podcasts in the many months since the pandemic started that I would not be surprised if we see the collapse of many governments in several African countries. So that is part of the process that is also underlying these challenges that we're seeing in many African countries. But in Sudan specifically, it was to prevent the civilian component of the transitional alliance, prevent it from taking power on November the 17th. Uh, I think that is sufficient given the amount of information that is out there on this coup d'etat. Obviously, if there are any significant developments, I will do another podcast looking into the situation in the Sudan. My next podcast will focus on the ongoing trial of the killers of Thomas Sankara in Burkina Faso. Welcome to all new patrons, sisters and brothers, supporters. Thank you for visiting episode number 44 of the African History Club. Stay strong, stay healthy, and remain Pan-African. Thank you.